Maybe as we settle in, take a few deep breaths. Maybe just make a note if you have anything in the mind that's worrisome or agitated or some care from earlier in the day. Just to note what might be a hindrance. It's good to take stock of where the mind's at. The mind is always working with different things. You might come into the present moment by letting the sensations of the breath at the nostrils be present in awareness. Noting the in-breath, noting the out-breath. In, out. How many times have you done that in your life? Taking a breath in, taking a breath out. Perhaps it seems mundane or uninteresting. But if you look, you might notice that no two breaths are ever the same. The pattern of sensation that is the breath is always different. There's always something to notice about the breath. You're meditating in this way with an object like the breath as an anchor. It's often helpful to find little interesting things to look at. You might notice something like how the length of the breath changes. Particularly in relation to what's going on in the body and mind. You might continue to let the attention be on the sensations of the breath, noticing whatever you're noticing. You also might look too to see if the sensations of the breath have changed in character from when you first started. Perhaps what initially seemed to be one mass of sensation, and seen more clearly, has become many little sensations. Perhaps not, but something too that can be noticed. and taking whatever concentration we've managed to generate, continuing to keep part of the attention in the breath. Perhaps you can let that move to the background. And let the foreground of the mind open up to all experience. There's something in particular that we might explore tonight. What is dukkha in this context, in the context of experiencing the present moment? You might understand dukkha as a feeling of resistance, feeling of wishing some part of experience to be other than the way it is. In the body, that often manifests as tension or tightness. Sometimes the mind doesn't like to examine those places. It might be trying to push away a pattern of thoughts that's been with you during meditation. What are you resisting? What are you not allowing to be? And following that, whatever it is that you're resisting, can you just let that be? Just let the present moment be as it is. Whatever that unpleasant phenomena is. It's just a phenomena, just a feeling or experience. It will arise and pass away on its own. And you just let that be without resistance. What are you resisting in this moment? What are you trying to push away? What is causing the mind to contract? Can you let that be? In these last 5 minutes, you can continue on if you like, noticing dukkha, noticing where you're resisting, and letting those be, doing whatever practice that you're doing. You can also simply completely let go Let go of any doing. Simply exists. It's the flow of experience. Nothing to do and no one to do it. Simply experience arising and passing away. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. It's good to see you all. So we've been talking about the three characteristics of existence. And those are anicca, dukkha, anatta. Three facts, I guess, about everything in existence. By everything, I really do mean everything. Everything you can see or smell or hear, touch or taste, and also any mental object too, thought or emotion or anything you can perceive has these three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta. And last week I talked about anicca, impermanence. And I mentioned that everything's in flux. Absolutely everything changes. Nothing is stable and solid. And kind of in contrast to anatta or dukkha, this is something we all know. We all have some understanding of this. We all know that the things that we acquire are going to break or fall apart or disintegrate. We know that the experiences we have, once they leave the present moment, they become memories, and memories are not the same as the experience itself. Memories fade in any case. And we know that this body and this life and the bodies and lives, the people around us that we care about, we know that someday that those will stop. We know this, but we don't live that understanding in the way that we interact with the world. In fact, we seem to spend most of our life in like acting in defiance of this fact, which like when you step outside of that and you look at that for what it is, it's kind of a funny phenomena actually. The analogy I use in my mind for that behavior is that is equivalent to doggy paddling, which I don't know, maybe you all know how to swim, but in case you don't, one of the first things that you're probably going to be taught when you learn to swim is how to doggy paddle. And that is basically trying to stay afloat by like doing this motion with your hands and kicking your feet. So the experience of doggy paddling, you can describe it as kind of pushing down on the water with your hand and meeting a little resistance and having that resistance be enough to kind of buoy you up a little bit. But it's not stable and permanent, and you push down and you start to sink back down. And so you do it with the other hand and push yourself up a little bit. And so the experience of this is just constantly trying to push yourself up with your hands. And this is a really apt analogy for how we relate to the world of experience. We're constantly grabbing at the world of experience for happiness. And just like when you're doggy paddling, you grab at something for happiness, and hopefully at least you get a little bit of that happiness, but it's not something you can pull yourself out of the water on. You're not, it's not stable. It's not lasting happiness. And that's the misunderstanding that the mind makes. The mind looks at whatever you're going to do. It looks at that piece of chocolate cake and it sees, oh, I'm going to eat that piece of chocolate cake and I'm going to be happy. But what it doesn't see is the happiness fading away. And we, despite having literally millions of examples of doing this behavior, we still make that mistake of thinking that the happiness that we find in whatever that we're doing is going to be lasting. It doesn't work that way. There's a kind of famous study that looked at two groups of people. It looked at lottery winners and people who had been in car accidents where they were paralyzed. And they looked at the happiness of these people before and after the event. And, the first part of it goes as you might expect. People who won the lottery were quite happy afterwards in the immediate aftermath. And people who were in a car accident were quite upset. But the thing that may be counterintuitive for some folks is that after about a year, people's happiness has more or less returned to baseline. And that's because things are impermanent. We grasp at the chocolate cake and we think it's solid, but we eat the chocolate cake and it disintegrates and it becomes something else. And the feelings that chocolate cake generates when we eat it, the joy or the happiness, perhaps they seem solid at first, but they too disintegrate and go away. Same thing with winning the lottery or even being in a car accident. I read a poll recently. I think this was about younger folks. I don't completely remember the details of the poll, but I think they were asking what people wanted to do with their life or what their life aspirations were. And, of course, take this with a grain of salt. It's just a poll, right? But something like 93% of the respondents said that they wanted to be rich. And, there's nothing inherently wrong with being rich, but presumably they said that because they thought being rich would lead to happiness. It doesn't work that way. If you grasp at the world of experience, the only thing you're ever going to get is something that's impermanent, because all of experience is impermanent. And this is dukkha. This is dukkha in the terms of, or in the context of the characteristics of existence. Nothing in experience, nothing that arises and passes away, can be a source of lasting satisfaction. Sometimes this is translated as life is suffering, but that's a bad translation. Sometimes there's suffering in life, but sometimes life is very pleasant. In this context, it's that anything in experience that arises and passes away is not a source of lasting satisfaction. And I know at least a couple of you guys were here when I was, actually I think all of you guys were here when I was talking about enlightenment. And I'm sure I made the point that enlightenment involves a state of mind that recognizes a permanent and lasting source of satisfaction or completeness or happiness or whatever word you want to use for it. And so on hearing that nothing in the world of experience can be a source of lasting satisfaction, the question you might ask is, how does one reach enlightenment then? I hope to talk about that next time when I talk about anatta, but the kind of spoiler answer is that there can be a source of, like a permanent source of stability and happiness, but it's found outside of the world of experience. And I hope to talk about that next week. So that is dukkha in the context of the three characteristics. And I wanted to make the point that, Damon had brought up a good point a couple of weeks ago about a lot of these poly terms being ambiguous. And dukkha is definitely one of those terms. Dukkha is very ambiguous. It's got a couple of different meanings. And I'm going to shift to talking about a different meaning of dukkha. In the context, I've just used it as a characteristic of all experience. It's that, nothing can be a source of lasting satisfaction. But I'm going to talk about dukkha in the context of, phenomenology, direct experience. And a definition for that might be something like wanting the present moment to be other than it is, something along those lines. So this being Buddhism, dukkha is broken down into categories. And I will read the Dukkhatta Sutta, which lays out the three categories of dukkha. And I'll read the whole thing because it's very short, but I'll paraphrase a little bit. So this is SN 45.165. It says, monks, there are these three kinds of suffering, or three kinds of dukkha. What three? One is dukkha caused by pain. Two is dukkha due to change. And three is dukkha caused by formations or sankharas. It is for the full comprehension, clear understanding, ending, and abandonment of these three that the Noble Eightfold Path is to be cultivated. that is the entirety of the sutta. So 3 types. The first type, dukkha due to pain, has the lovely Pali name dukkha dukkha. And this is pretty direct, but to like disambiguate and be precise about my words, dukkha is often translated as suffering, and the English word suffering would encompass things that are not part of dukkha. If that made sense. So there's the physical experience of pain. So if you break your leg or whatever, the physical experience of that is not dukkha. The Four Noble Truths say that Buddhism has a way for us to let go of dukkha or to find our way out of dukkha. Buddhism does not get rid of breaking your leg. Breaking your leg is going to feel a certain way, regardless of if you're enlightened or not. Where dukkha comes in is after that. So there's the physical pain of breaking your leg, and then there's the sense that I want this pain to go away. That is dukkha. And specifically in relation to pain, that is dukkha. So dukkha from pain. And the thing to note here is the first part of that sequence is not optional. You're going to have pain at some point in your life. That's just a fact of being a human being. But the second part is, and for a broken leg, that may be kind of a heavy lift, but it is possible. And for lesser forms of pain, it's something that a practitioner can do. I guess the difference in my mind, like I'm comparing kind of 2 events when I was in some physical pain. A few years ago, I tore a muscle in my back, and it was quite painful, and it was quite painful, pretty much all the time, whether I was laying down or standing up or whatever. So there was a lot of just like wanting that to be gone, because I had my life to do, and I was working and trying to do things, and just this constant source of pain, I wanted to go away. But I'm contrasting that in my mind to the time when I broke my toe. I was I think 6, so I was quite young, and we were my family had gone to Disney World. This was I think the first and only time I'd been to Disney World, and we got to our hotel, and there was a water park outside of our hotel, and I went down the slide, and I broke my toe. So I was spent our whole trip at Disney World with a broken toe in this kind of medical shoe thing. But my memories of that time were very pleasant. I enjoyed my time there, and it wasn't I'm sure there was probably some dukkha, but for the most part, it didn't seem to need it to go away. I could just function with that pain. And so to my mind, that's kind of showing the difference, like where dukkha is and where it can go away. There's a famous sutta that speaks to kind of this point, the Dart Sutta. This is SN 36.6. I will read a bit of this. It says, bhikkhus, the uninstructed worldling, so somebody who doesn't know the Dhamma, the uninstructed worldling feels a pleasant feeling, a painful feeling, and one that's neither. The instructed noble disciple too, so somebody who knows the Dhamma, the instructed noble disciple too feels a pleasant feeling, a painful feeling, and one that's neither. Therein, bhikkhus, what is the distinction between the noble disciple and the uninstructed worldling? So they sort of go back and forth, and he goes on to answer this. And he says, bhikkhus, when the uninstructed worldling is being contacted by a painful feeling, he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught. He has 2 feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. You can also think of this as like the first and second feeling, if that's easier. Suppose they were to strike a man with a dart, and then they would strike him immediately afterwards with the second dart, so that the man would feel a feeling caused by 2 darts. So too, when the uninstructed worldling is being contacted by a painful feeling, He feels two feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. So a little bit later on, he says, bhikkhus, when the instructed noble disciple is contacted by a painful feeling, he does not sorrow, grieve, or lament. He does not weep, beating his breast, and become distraught. He feels one feeling, a bodily one, not a mental one. Suppose they were to strike a man with a dart, but they would not strike him immediately afterward with the second dart, so that the man would feel a feeling caused by one dart only. So too, when the instructed noble disciple is contacted by the painful feeling, he feels one feeling, a bodily one, not a mental one. And so that's relevant for dukkha in general. There's always the initial feeling and the initial non-optional feeling, and the second feeling that we can learn to not react that way. So I wanted to offer maybe a little bit of thought about how to work with each of the kinds of dukkha. And so for dukkha, the thing that is helpful to me is to, or I'll say two things actually, is to examine the feeling closely. So pain is a physical sensation, and the mind really doesn't want to look at that. It likes to push that away. But if you can look at it in detail, you can notice that it's not actually one feeling. There's often a bunch of different stuff going on, and when you can break it apart into pieces, it seems to dissipate a lot of its energy. So that's one thing I would offer. The second thing is that if you manage to be with this feeling of pain for long enough without pushing it away, or without pushing it away too much, sometimes something really interesting can happen. When you can just be with the pain without aversion, sometimes the mind gets confused as to how to categorize this feeling, and sometimes it can become actually pleasurable. Sometimes it'll vacillate between, back and forth between the two, which is it is interesting, but it's also quite helpful. It's much easier to be with something that's pleasant, or sometimes pleasant, than it's always painful and it's always pushed away. And I haven't really had any chronic pain, but I understand that sometimes people with chronic pain can report quite a bit of improvement in their condition if they kind of be with it in a meditative context. So the second type of dukkha is dukkha due to change, viparinama dukkha. This is somewhat like I was, somewhat akin to what I was trying to get to at the beginning. The world changes, and we misunderstand, or we don't fully internalize that change, and that change leads to dukkha. Basically, the pleasant feelings from our cravings don't last. The kind of analogy here, or the example I have here, is that when I moved up to DC about a decade ago, this was a very big change for me. I went from being in grad school and living kind of in my hometown with my parents, to living on my own and working in this job, and just everything about my life changed, like what I ate, who I saw, my day-to-day routine. And it wasn't that anything about my new life was bad. I had all my needs taken care of. I had I had food, I had shelter, I had a job that I knew that I could do. So I wasn't having any pain to generate dukkha, but this was still a really difficult time for me. Just I remember just some nights just lying in bed, just not thinking I could continue on in this kind of environment. And it wasn't anything directly painful. It was just so much change for me, and I was not used to it. I was not ready. I was not accepting of it. It was just the fact that things were different. And that's a very very understandable response. Like the response to dukkha dukkha was understandable too. Um, we have our model of the world, and um, that model of the world gives us safety, a sense of safety. We think we know how the world is and how it should be, and when that changes, even if what it changes to is not, not inherently bad, the fact that our model has been broken or no longer works, it's pretty uncomfortable. It can be pretty uncomfortable at a pretty deep level. And so to deal with this, really the way I think about it, it's just you really need to like dive right into impermanence. You just really need to lean into the fact that this is how the world is. Just simply acknowledging that fact often brings acceptance. And finally, the third type of dukkha we have is sankhara dukkha. Sankhara is another word that means a whole bunch of different things, but without giving a definition here, I think of this dukkha as the dukkha of the story. And it's a bit different than the other two kinds of dukkha in that it's less an immediate reaction to a kind of fundamental quality of experience. It's something that comes along afterwards. So going back to the story of the broken leg or the broken toe or whatever, there's the initial feeling, the pain. There's the dukkha dukkha, and then comes the story, right? So it could be anything. It could be if you fall and break your leg, it could be I'm so angry at myself that I didn't see where the hole was, and I'm so upset about the people who own the sidewalk. Why didn't they get it fixed? And I should sue them. And da 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 da. The story. Sometimes it never stops. You can have stories for years and years and years. You can have stories your whole life. So there's the first dart and the second dart, but often the story has many, many, many darts. It's just something to think about, I think. Our total amount of suffering, painful feelings or whatever, we have some like very small amount that's not optional. We're going to have to experience, but I think the vast majority of it is something that we can let go of. And for me, at least, most of that was tied up in stories. I think maybe that's true for a lot of people. I don't know about everyone. The way I would suggest working with stories is it's maybe a bit different than the other two. The dukkha dukkha and viparinama dukkha are like pretty straightforward and understandable kind of instinctual responses. But when the story comes into play, like the mind generally wants to keep those stories going. So it will find reasons to like why that story is true. And so sometimes it's helpful to be a little more intellectual about how you engage with the story, about kind of thinking your way through why the story is not true, as opposed to like dukkha dukkha or viparinama dukkha, where you can just kind of note it or note the impermanence. So you might notice the emptiness of the story. You might notice that this is all simply constructs of the mind. You making up ideas about why things are the way they are and how they are the way they are. Those are all ephemeral and can be seen through and can be let go of. So those were the three types of dukkha. And you can talk about them individually, but you can also talk about them as a group too. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that. Dukkha is wanting the world to be other than the way it is. It is wanting the present moment to be different than it is. And at a very You can engage with this at a very like deep and fundamental level. Just like skip everything else and just engage directly with that fact. The present moment is how it is. There's nothing you can do about the present moment. If you want to change circumstances, that's sometime in the future. Perhaps there's something you can do about things that happen in the future, but the present moment is the way it is. And really internalizing that fact leads directly to acceptance, because your choice is either to not accept it and suffer, or to accept it and not suffer. And that is really the only choice you have about the present moment. This has actually been my practice for the past couple of years, is engaging with dukkha in that way. When I sit, just let the mind be the flow of experience, and anything that starts to solidify or the mind tries to push away or whatever, it would just be let go of. It's just that like very, very simple, very direct practice, that very direct application of the third noble truth. The cessation of craving leads to the cessation of dukkha. If you see craving in the moment and you let go, dukkha in the moment is let go of too. And that can be a practice, just that very simple action. I will say that's not usually taught as a practice, but it's worked out well for me, so I wanted to offer that to you all. That's what I have for you all today.